There are moments when the internet decides someone's guilt before the facts even finish loading. This was one of those moments. It started with 1 million views, a single accusation, and a narrative that spread faster than anyone could stop it. A man who had spent years quietly helping one of the most vulnerable families in America suddenly found himself labeled something else entirely. A scammer, an exploiter, a fraud. And once that label sticks, most people never wait for clarification. This is not a defense piece. It's not an emotional appeal. It's not a plea for sympathy. It's the record. Because when reputations are destroyed in public, the only thing that matters is what can be proven. Mark Lyda didn't come forward to chase clout. He didn't come forward to argue with strangers. He came forward because the story had crossed a line from misunderstanding into outright damage, and silence had begun to look like guilt. For years, Mark had been known for one thing: sitting quietly across from people society prefers not to see. Through long-form, patient interviews, he documented lives shaped by poverty, addiction, trauma, and isolation. He didn't rush them. He didn't sensationalize them. He let them exist on camera as they were. None of those stories hit harder than the Whittaker family of West Virginia. When audiences first encountered the Whittakers, the reaction was immediate and visceral. People were shocked. Some were disturbed. Others were moved. What they saw was raw humanity, rural poverty, genetic isolation, and a family that had lived almost entirely outside the modern world's safety nets. The response was predictable and yet overwhelming. How can we help? That question didn't come from Mark. It came from viewers, thousands of them. Messages flooded in asking what could be done for Betty, Larry, Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy. Food, clothes, transportation, basic survival needs. So a GoFundMe was created. Not hidden, not vague. Public, transparent, labeled. The original fundraiser was meant for immediate relief: food, clothing, transportation, basic living expenses. Nothing extravagant, nothing symbolic, just help. And help came. Tens of thousands of dollars poured in, not because of manipulation, but because people felt something real and wanted to respond to it. According to public records, that first GoFundMe raised approximately $77,000. But real life doesn't pause just because money appears. Every few weeks, Mark says, the calls came in. We're out of food. The car broke down. We can't pay the bill. We need help. And every time he responded, not in theory, not in promises, in wires, transfers, real money, sent directly to Betty Whittaker's bank account in West Virginia. Amounts ranged from a few $1,000s at a time to as much as $14,000 in a single transfer, sometimes more than once in the same month. This wasn't charity theater. It was triage. Over time, viewers began asking a bigger question. If the Whittakers needed so much help just to survive, what about something permanent? Something stable? A house. That idea didn't come from Mark alone. It grew organically from the audience. People wanted a clean ending, a rescue narrative, a moment where everything changed and the story could be put down. So a second GoFundMe was created. This one clearly labeled, explicitly stated, money for a house. That fundraiser raised roughly $55,000. Between both campaigns, the total approached $130,000. On paper, it sounded like a miracle. In reality, it became a slow-motion collapse of expectations. Because while donors imagined savings accumulating toward a future home, the Whittakers were still living day to day. emergency to emergency, crisis to crisis. The GoFundMe balance didn't sit untouched. It drained continuously, not into luxury, not into scams, but into survival. Food doesn't wait for long-term planning. Cars don't break down on schedule. Bills don't pause for dreams. According to Mark, the house fund never had a chance to become what people envisioned. Every time money came in, something urgent took it back out. And when donations slowed, Mark didn't stop helping. He used his own money. By his own accounting, over $100,000 was transferred directly to the Whittakers, with an additional $25,000 paid out of his personal funds when GoFundMe balances hit zero. There's another detail most people never consider: taxes. GoFundMe donations are taxable income to the organizer. Mark could have passed that burden onto the Whittakers, but he didn't. He paid the tax bill himself, roughly 37%, absorbing a financial hit most people criticizing him never even thought about. None of this mattered until it did. The turning point came with a viral video. In it, Betty Whittaker is asked simple questions. Where did the money go? What house? Her answers are hesitant, confused, at times dismissive. I don't know. What house? To an audience with no context, no timeline, and no background, it looked devastating. 1 million people watched and drew the same conclusion. Something was wrong. What they didn't see yet was the rest of the story. The phone calls, the bank records, the follow-up conversation that happened after the cameras stopped rolling. They didn't hear Betty later acknowledge that money had been coming in regularly, that transfers arrived every few weeks, that she believed the funds were coming directly from Mark, not from a house fund. Not deception, misunderstanding. But by then, the narrative had already hardened. Scammer, exploiter, fraud. The internet doesn't wait for clarification. It rewards certainty, even when it's wrong. This is where the damage began. And this is where Mark Lyda finally spoke. Not to defend his ego, but to put facts where speculation had taken over. In the next part, we'll examine the moment the accusation went viral, what was left out of the edit, and how outrage became more valuable than accuracy overnight. Before you move on, comment below one thing. Should public charity require public punishment when stories don't end the way people expect? The moment the accusation went viral, the story stopped being about money and started being about trust. That's the point most people miss. Because outrage online is rarely about evidence. It's about betrayal. Viewers didn't just feel confused. They felt personally wronged. They believed they had donated toward a clear ending, a house, stability, closure. And suddenly that ending wasn't there. And when an ending disappears, people look for someone to blame. The viral video didn't accuse Mark Lyda outright. It didn't say, he stole the money. It didn't need to. All it did was show Betty Whittaker looking unsure, saying she didn't know where the money went, and appearing unaware of any house plan. In the internet economy, implication is enough. Once viewers see a vulnerable person say, I don't know, their minds fill in the rest. The edit does the work. Silence becomes suspicion. Confusion becomes guilt. What made it worse was the framing. The video positioned itself as investigative. Serious music, serious tone, serious pauses. It asked questions without waiting for answers. It showed uncertainty without explaining context. And most importantly, it never gave the accused a voice in the same frame. That absence mattered, because viewers didn't see the years before that moment. They didn't see the dozens of transfers. They didn't see the late-night phone calls. They didn't see the bank screenshots or the tax payments. All they saw was a gap between expectation and reality, and a man whose name sat in the middle of that gap. That's how reputations collapse online, not through proof, but through framing. The creator behind the video, Tyler Oliveira, didn't claim to be a prosecutor. He claimed to be a storyteller. But in a story like this, storytelling carries consequences. Mark would later state that Tyler never contacted him directly for comment. Not once. There was no request for receipts, no chance to explain, no verification step beyond what could be captured on camera in a short interaction with Betty. And that choice mattered, too. Because journalism, real journalism, relies on confrontation with facts, not just footage. It asks uncomfortable questions to all sides. It checks records. It allows responses. What happened here followed a different incentive structure. Speed over depth. Shock over clarity. Views over verification. Once the video crossed 1 million views, the internet did what it always does. It turned analysis into judgment. Comment sections filled with certainty. He stole it. He used them. This is why you don't trust YouTubers. Another predator exposed. None of those commenters had seen a single bank record. None of them had spoken to Mark. None of them had asked how recurring emergencies work when a family lives in extreme poverty with no financial literacy, no budgeting structure, and no safety net. The narrative didn't ask those questions because they complicate the villain arc, and villains are easier to digest. For Mark, the fallout wasn't theoretical. It was immediate and personal. Years of credibility evaporated in days. Messages shifted from gratitude to abuse. People who had once praised his work now accused him of exploiting the very people he tried to protect. What stung most, according to him, wasn't the strangers. It was the silence. No public defense from the family. No clarification posts. No one stepping in to say, "Wait, there's more to this." And from Mark's perspective, that silence wasn't malicious. It was structural. The Whittakers were never equipped to navigate a viral scandal. Betty struggled with details. Larry had limited understanding of money at that scale. Expecting them to correct a 1 million-view narrative was unrealistic. But the internet didn't care. Silence was read as confirmation. That's when Mark did something he had avoided up to that point. He brought out the receipts. Not selectively, not theatrically. He showed full wire transfer histories, dates, amounts, destination accounts, repeated payments sent directly to Betty Whittaker's bank, thousands at a time, over and over again. He explained the taxes, the out-of-pocket payments, the moments when the GoFundMe balance hit zero and he continued sending money anyway. And then he did something else, something quieter. He called Betty, on camera. No yelling, no pressure, no editing tricks. He walked her through the timeline slowly, asked simple questions. Have I been sending you money? Yes. How often? Every few weeks. How much? Sometimes 4,000, sometimes 5, sometimes more. That call changed the facts, but it didn't change the narrative, because by then, the internet had already chosen its story. The explanation, that Betty believed the money was coming directly from Mark rather than from a house fund, didn't register emotionally. To many viewers, it sounded like backpedaling. To others, it didn't matter. They had already moved on to the next outrage. This is where the system breaks down. Online, Clarification rarely travels as far as accusation. A million views can be built on implication, but truth usually spreads in fragments. Screenshots, long explanations, videos people are too busy to watch. The algorithm rewards outrage, not resolution. And Mark learned that lesson the hard way. He wasn't accused because money was missing. The money was traceable. He was accused because expectations weren't met, because people wanted a house, not survival receipts. They wanted a transformation, not a ledger. But real life doesn't resolve like content. In real life, money meant for the future often gets swallowed by the present, especially when the present involves hunger, broken vehicles, heating issues, addiction in the extended family, and people who have never been taught how to manage more than a few dollars at a time. That nuance didn't go viral. What went viral was doubt. And doubt, once unleashed, doesn't need proof to spread. By the end of that week, Mark had reached a conclusion he never expected to reach. Helping publicly had become more dangerous than helping privately, not because the help was wrong, but because the internet demanded a story that reality couldn't provide. In the next part, we'll look at what happens when truth loses to virality, why Mark decided to walk away entirely, and what this controversy reveals about how easily compassion turns into punishment online. Before you move on, answer this honestly in the comments. If every dollar was sent, but the ending wasn't what donors imagined, does that make help a failure, or the expectation the problem? By the time Mark Lyta realized the truth no longer mattered, the damage was already done. Not because the receipts were weak, not because the explanations didn't add up, but because the internet had moved past facts and into judgment. This is the phase most stories never unpack. What happens after the accusation sticks? Because once someone is labeled a scammer online, the burden of proof reverses. Innocence isn't presumed. It's demanded over and over by people who have already decided they don't believe you. For Mark, the consequences weren't just reputational. They were existential to the work he had built his life around. For years, his approach had been simple. Show people as they are, help quietly where possible, and keep the focus on dignity, not spectacle. But suddenly, dignity became suspicious. Privacy became evidence of guilt. Boundaries were framed as secrecy. The same instincts that once protected vulnerable people were now used against him. Why didn't you show everything? Why didn't you force accountability? Why didn't you control how they spent the money? Those questions reveal something uncomfortable. They assume power. They assume that, because Mark facilitated donations, he should have also become a financial controller, a social worker, a guardian, and an enforcer. They assume he should have overridden the autonomy of adults, however limited, because the audience expected a specific outcome. But that was never his role. And turning a documentarian into a manager is where helping turns dangerous. Because the moment you start dictating how aid is used, you cross a line from assistance into control. And with vulnerable families, that line is razor thin. Mark understood that. Many critics didn't. They wanted results, not process. A house, a before and after, a clean ending. What they got instead was the messy reality of poverty. Recurring emergencies, no savings, no long-term planning capacity, and constant crisis management. That's not cinematic. It doesn't resolve in a thumbnail, and it doesn't reward patience. So the audience punished the messenger. As the backlash intensified, Mark noticed another pattern. The loudest critics were often people who had never donated, never helped, and never asked what it actually costs to keep a struggling family afloat month after month. They weren't reacting to loss. They were reacting to disappointment. And disappointment online often masquerades as moral outrage. Behind the scenes, Mark began receiving messages not just accusing him, but warning him. Some implied legal trouble. Others hinted at exposing him further. A few demanded access to the Whittakers directly. That's when he drew a hard line. No more intermediating help in public. Because what started as compassion had turned into liability. Not just for him, but for the very people he was trying to protect. The irony is brutal. The internet claimed it wanted transparency, but punished anyone who showed complexity. It demanded proof, but ignored it when it arrived quietly instead of explosively. It wanted accountability, but only in one direction. Mark was accountable. The narrative was not. And then came the moment that sealed his decision. He realized that no amount of evidence would change minds that were already emotionally invested in outrage. The receipts were dismissed as damage control. The phone call with Betty was reframed as manipulation. Even paying taxes on the donations himself was twisted into suspicion. At that point, continuing publicly wasn't noble. It was self-destructive. So he stopped. No more GoFundMes. No more fundraising tied to vulnerable families. No more public charity that could be weaponized. This wasn't bitterness. It was adaptation. He understood something most people don't until it's too late. Helping in public doesn't just expose the recipient. It exposes the helper to expectations that no human being can safely meet. Because once you help once, the internet decides you are responsible forever. Responsible for outcomes. Responsible for mistakes you didn't make. Responsible for systems you don't control. And when something goes wrong, the helper becomes the villain. Mark didn't disappear. He didn't rage post. He didn't sue. He didn't attack Tyler Oliveira or demand retractions. He simply documented what happened and stepped back. That choice says more than any defense ever could. Because if this had been a scam, walking away would have been impossible. The money would have needed to keep flowing. The exposure would have been necessary. The narrative would have required maintenance. Instead, Mark chose silence. And silence is expensive when you've already been convicted in the court of public opinion. What makes this part of the story uncomfortable is that it implicates everyone watching. Because the outrage economy doesn't survive on villains alone. It survives on audiences who reward accusation more than explanation, who click faster than they verify, and who confuse emotional satisfaction with truth. Mark became collateral damage in a system that doesn't care who's right, only who's loud. And the Whittakers, they didn't win either, because the fallout didn't bring them clarity or stability. It brought more scrutiny, more distrust, more chaos, more people deciding what should have happened without understanding what actually did. In the next part, we'll confront the hardest question of all. If the money reached the family, but the story still destroyed lives, who is actually responsible? And we'll look at what this controversy reveals about us. Not just content creators, not just donors, but everyone participating in a system that punishes nuance and feeds on certainty. Before you move on, pause and answer this in the comments. When helping publicly turns into a trial with no judge and no rules, does anyone really win? By the time the receipts were posted, the calls replayed, and the timelines clarified, one uncomfortable truth had already settled in. The story was no longer about money. It was about blame. Because when a story goes viral, facts stop being the currency. Emotion does. And once outrage takes over, someone has to carry it. Not the system, not the conditions, not the decades of poverty or isolation or disability. A person. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the money reached the family, if the transfers are documented, if the taxes were paid, and if the help continued even after the fundraisers ended, then what exactly was the crime people needed to believe in? The answer is simpler and darker than most want to admit. The crime was failing to deliver a fantasy. The internet didn't just want the Whittakers helped. It wanted them transformed. It wanted a clean arc, a savior, a redemption story that could be closed, shared, and moved on from. But reality doesn't bend like that. What Mark ran into wasn't suspicion. It was disappointment disguised as justice. Because once viewers were told that over $100,000 had been raised, their imagination filled in the rest. A new house, stability, a finished chapter, and when that didn't happen, the disappointment needed somewhere to land. It couldn't land on the Whittakers. They were too vulnerable. It couldn't land on poverty. That's too abstract. It couldn't land on disability. That's uncomfortable. So it landed on Mark. This is where the story shifts from personal controversy to structural failure. Because what happened here isn't unique. It's a pattern. In online charity narratives, the helper becomes the stand-in for every broken promise the system never fulfilled. When outcomes don't match expectations, the helper absorbs the anger meant for everything else. Healthcare systems that never intervened, social services that never sustained support, a society that only noticed suffering once it went viral. None of those things trend, but accusing one identifiable person does. And that's why the evidence didn't matter, because evidence explains. Outrage replaces. Once Tyler Oliveira's video framed the question as, "Where did the money go?" the audience didn't actually want the answer. They wanted a culprit. The ambiguity itself was the product. That framing did something subtle but powerful. It shifted the burden of understanding away from complexity and onto suspicion. It implied that confusion equals guilt, that poverty must come with accounting clarity, that people with limited education and capacity should track funds the way institutions do. That expectation alone reveals how detached the audience was from the reality they claimed to care about. Betty Whittaker didn't misunderstand maliciously. She misunderstood structurally. She lived in survival mode for decades. Money came in waves and went out in emergencies. The idea of earmarked funds, long-term savings goals, and delayed gratification was never part of her world. Not because of dishonesty, but because of circumstance. But the internet doesn't forgive circumstance. It demands performance. And when Betty didn't perform clarity on camera, the narrative snapped shut. What followed wasn't investigation. It was reinforcement. Creators repeated the implication. Commenters escalated it. Forums crystallized it. And suddenly, questions hardened into facts. Mark's attempts to explain were reframed as defensive. His documentation was labeled damage control. His silence was interpreted as guilt. Every move was wrong, because the verdict had already been reached. This is how reputational destruction actually works in the digital age, not through proof, through momentum. And momentum doesn't care who gets hurt as long as engagement keeps flowing. The hardest part to confront is this. No one who benefited from the outrage had an incentive to slow down. The video gained millions of views. Reaction channels gained traffic. Comment sections filled. The algorithm rewarded intensity, and Mark paid the price. But There's another layer that almost no one talks about. The Whittakers didn't benefit from this either, because once the scandal took over, their story stopped being about need and became about suspicion. Donors pulled back. Support dried up. People who might have helped quietly stayed away, afraid of being the next target. Public charity became radioactive, so the family ended up with less, not more. This is the collateral damage no one tracks, and it leads to a painful realization. If helping publicly becomes too dangerous, the only people left willing to help are those who want control, clout, or leverage. The careful ones walk away. The ethical ones retreat. The quiet helpers disappear. That's not a win for justice. That's how exploitation actually increases. Mark understood this before most people did. That's why he didn't fight the internet. He exited it. He recognized that staying in the spotlight would only prolong harm to himself and to the family. And unlike the people demanding explanations, he didn't need the attention. Walking away was the only ethical move left. But the damage was already done, because reputations don't recover at the speed they're destroyed. Accusations travel farther than corrections. And even now, long after the receipts were shown, there are still people who only remember the allegation. That's the final cruelty of viral judgment. It doesn't update. So we're left with a question that goes beyond Mark Lea, Tyler Oliveira, or the Whittakers. What responsibility does an audience have when it consumes a story about vulnerable people? Is it enough to feel outraged? Is it enough to demand accountability from one person? Or does responsibility also mean understanding limits, context, and the difference between wrongdoing and disappointment? Because if the standard becomes perfect outcomes or else, then no one acting in good faith will survive public scrutiny. And that's exactly the environment we've built. One where nuance is punished, where helpers are presumed guilty, where poverty is judged through middle-class expectations, and where silence is mistaken for secrecy instead of exhaustion. The truth is uncomfortable. Mark didn't fail the Whittakers. The system failed them long before he arrived, and the internet failed them again by turning survival into a spectacle and complexity into a crime. In the final part, we'll strip this down to its core. Not the drama, not the accusations, but the lesson. What this story teaches about helping, about attention, and about the cost of caring in public, and why sometimes the most honest ending isn't redemption, but withdrawal. Before moving on, sit with this and answer honestly. If truth requires patience and outrage requires nothing, which one are we really rewarding? At the end of all of this, there isn't a courtroom verdict. There isn't a viral apology tour. There isn't even closure in the way the internet understands it. There is only a lesson, and it's the kind of lesson that doesn't sound dramatic when you say it out loud, but it cuts the deepest when you live it. If a 91-year-old man could sit across from his 40-year-old self and speak plainly without performance, without trying to impress anyone, this is what he would say. Be careful who you help in public. Not because helping is wrong, not because people don't deserve help, but because once you invite the crowd in, the crowd doesn't leave quietly. When you're young, you believe truth protects you. You believe receipts matter. You believe good intentions count for something. Age teaches you otherwise. Age teaches you that once a narrative forms, facts arrive too late to stop it. That strangers don't owe you fairness. That silence will be interpreted however it's most convenient. And that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee you'll be seen as a good person, only as a useful one. Until you're not, The hardest lesson isn't that people accused Mark falsely. It's that most people didn't care whether it was true. They cared that the story felt right. They cared that it gave them someone to be angry at without examining the systems that allowed the Whittakers to live the way they did for decades. They cared that it spared them from asking why poverty, disability, and isolation persist in plain sight. Blame is easier than responsibility. A 91-year-old knows this because he's seen it repeat itself in different costumes, different names, same ending. You help, you get watched, you get questioned, then one day you get accused. And when that happens, you learn the most important boundary of all. Not every truth needs an audience. Mark didn't stop caring. He stopped performing care. He didn't walk away because he was guilty. He walked away because the cost of staying became higher than the good it could do. That's not weakness. That's wisdom earned late. If he could speak to his younger self, he wouldn't say, "Don't help." He'd say this: help quietly, help locally, help without cameras, help without promises you can't control, and never confuse public gratitude with private integrity, because the internet doesn't protect the generous. It consumes them. And the final, most brutal truth is this: you can give everything you have, money, time, energy, compassion, and still be remembered as the villain if the story needs one. So choose carefully where you place your name. Choose carefully whose suffering you attach it to. And understand this before it costs you years of your life. Doing good publicly doesn't make you safer. It makes you visible. And visibility without mercy is one of the most dangerous things a person can offer. That's the advice. Not bitter, not angry, just honest. Now, I want to hear from you, because this isn't just about one man. If you were in his place, would you help again the same way? Or would you protect your peace first? Comment below. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.